Hello, I'm John Connolly, and I'm going to give you an introduction into theorising public policy as part of your learning about policy analysis. So in terms of theorising about public policy, the key aim of this discussion really for me, and this will feed into our discussion when we meet, is to introduce and critique the different theories and models that help us to understand public policy processes. I think it's fair to say that public policy is a complex set of issues, decisions, actors, and values. And essentially, what policy analysts try to do is sometimes try and make sense of complexity. So I think we have to acknowledge that policy is complex from the very outset. And I think that once we do that, it kind of helps us reinforce and deal with some of the complexities. But policy theories, in many senses, are there to help us to try and organize our minds, organize our thinking, in order to be able to deal with that complexity. So in some ways, theories help us to compartmentalize phenomena and help us to study public policy decision-making and its outcomes using a certain analytical lens, which give a certain emphasis on certain things. So for instance, it depends on your research question, but if you're interested in how institutions change over time, there's a good chance that you might want to engage with the institutionalism theories of public policy. If you're interested in how ideas change, policy ideas change over time, then you might be interested in things like multiple streams theory or the agenda setting theories. So it depends on how you're approaching public policy. And it depends what you're interested in. The theories can offer you different perspectives in order to look at an issue, a policy question, or a policy problem from a particular angle. Okay, so a theory is a set of analytical principles designed to structure our observation and explanation of the world. Okay, structure or observation. So that relates to what I just said about trying to bring a degree of order, a degree of cohesion to how we systematize our thinking about the complex realities of the world. The purpose of theories, models, and frameworks is to describe, explain, or predict. They do this by naming and framing the topic by using concepts and propositions. Now, so Paul Kearney is cited in this slide. I think it's fair to say that Paul Kearney is one of your key people that you should be reading about theorising public policy, because he's been one of the key individuals in the social sciences who's been writing on this topic in more contemporary times. Having said that, it depends on what you're interested in. So people like Paul Kearney will be interesting for you to look at if you're looking to get a whistle-stop tour of different theories. But if you want depth into particular types of theory, be it institutionalism or, it could be rational models or incrementalism, it's often good to actually go to the original literature around those theories. But having said that, Kearney's work gives us a really good overview of a range of different theories, and he's been key when it comes to research into the area of evidence-based policy making. And one of the things that you will become aware of is that there's often a troubled relationship between evidence and policy. Evidence doesn't always neatly translate into policy for a number of different reasons. And one of the things that Paul Kearney allows us to do is to understand those dilemmas and complexities. But he does it from a general position, really, of systems or complex theory thinking. So he really helps us wrestle with the idea of the complexities of public policy and what a more systems-based perspective can offer to that. So we'll talk about some of those strands in this talk as well. It's fair to say there's different types of theory. So theory is not just, does not serve just one purpose. You have normative, or you could even describe it as prescriptive theory. And this relates to how things should be. So a theory about how society should look, how it should be organized, how policy should be made. So if you subscribe to the rational model of public policy, it might be that you believe that policy decision making should be an entirely rational process. It's deliberative. It brings in a range of forms of evidence. That evidence is weighted up across different options, and then a choice is made, and then a policy is evaluated after it's been executed. A bit like the policy cycle framework that you have been engaging with. So in some ways, that's a prescriptive account of how policy should be. But actually, the policy cycle framework itself can also be descriptive. So it might be a description or a metaphorical interpretation as to what policy processes are like. Sometimes policy theorists approach their theory based on how they understand the general realities of life to be. So if you're an incrementalist or an incremental scholar of public policy, it might be that you decide that actually policies succeed each other. One policy builds on the other. You know, there's a kind of reciprocal relationship between the ends and means and outcomes of policy that trundle on, and policies take different shapes, but they're dependent upon what's came before. Then that might be that you're describing how change happens within political systems or policy systems. So you might actually say, well, incrementalists might be describing the situation. So it might be that theories can do both things. They can be normative and prescriptive, but it might be that certain theories lend themselves more to a normative or a descriptive interpretation. I think it's fair to say there's some key themes in understanding public policy, and these themes are very much related to theories of public policy too. So if you think about power, politics, and agenda setting, you know, agenda setting is very much an area related closely to multiple streams theory. And it's about how politics, ideas, and the context all work together to shift an agenda. What is it that keeps something off the policy agenda? What is it that brings something on the policy agenda? So it might be, you could be looking at the example of, for instance, parties in Downing Street. What shifted the agenda there? Well, perhaps it was about leaks from Downing Street, and then the media picking up on the story. There's enough public attention given to it, therefore the news media dominates with a particular story. And then the politics follow from that. Should the Prime Minister remain in place? What happens to the Conservative Party? All these different ideas. But essentially what you can see there is a shift in the agenda, and often requires some kind of an event or some critical juncture to occur to shift the agenda. Who are the powerful actors in public policy? Well, it depends on the policy you're focused on, but generally, you know, it could be politicians themselves, political parties, could be the media, could be multinational corporations. It depends on the policy, because every policy has its own subsystem, which we'll talk about soon. And what that is really is a fancy way of saying that every policy has a context. Every policy has a stakeholder environment, and the power dynamics between different policy areas can be different. So the actors that surround, say, for instance, defence policy might be different to that of, say, regional policy or health policy. The stakeholder interests will be different, and the composition of different actors will be different as well. But understanding that and understanding who the agenda shifters are is a helpful way of understanding public policy. Governance is really emerged from more policy network thinking approaches to public policy. And essentially what it helps us to do is to understand the landscape of policy, the institutional and group dynamics and policy dynamics that surround a problem. Or it could be understanding the composition of the state at multiple levels of governance. If you're in the, say for instance, we're in Scotland when we're teaching this, but if you're looking at Scotland's policy system from a governance perspective, you might be interested in looking at it from different lenses and different levels. For instance, if you're thinking about the policy landscape at a national level in Scotland, you might also have to think about how the national and the local governance levels work together, the relationship between national and local government and vice versa, how perhaps the Scottish government relate to the UK government and that dynamic and vice versa, and also the role of international governance systems and policy arenas and organisations that might have a bearing on how public policy is formed and delivered within Scotland you might be interested in, and at the UK level. So what about the role of the IMF, the World Bank, the WHO, aspects of the European Union, although we'll be a third country out with the post-Brexit. These governance issues are very important because one of the things that you often seek to do as a policy analyst, so when you're doing your assignments or when you're doing your research, whatever policy area you're interested in, you might want to think to yourself, well, where does the power actually lie for this policy? Who controls the levers? Do they exist at the Scottish level? Is it the Scottish government that's in charge of this policy? Or is it the national UK government, or is it beyond? So if I was going to influence this policy, where should I go? If I was a lobbyist, which level of government should I focus on so that decision-making processes go in my interest and I try and build relationships with stakeholders at that level on the basis of having some influence? So governance is about the architecture of policy. So, the landscape, the institutions, where the power lies, and so on. There's also a key theme in public policy research around individuals and institutions, and sociologists would describe this as the structure and agency issue, the relationship between policy and the individual and individual behaviours. Do individuals see a policy as legitimate, and do they adhere to it? Do they play the game? Do they act in the way that the structure want them to act? If they don't, in some ways that leads to a process of delegitimization and complexity, and perhaps some degree of disorder. So for governance and for policymakers, it's quite difficult to ensure that you get that balance right in order to ensure popular consent of policy. So really what we're saying here is that policy is also about behaviours, the relationship between structure and agency, the relationship between government and people, individuals and communities. How is that shaped? What is the relationship and behaviours, and what are the outcomes from that? Bureaucratic politics, policy networks, group politics, very much part of the network thinking perspectives. Bureaucratic politics refers to the relationship between actors within the policy system who are responsible in some way for making the policy and implementing the policy. So it might be that, for instance, you have a number of different government departments that are at each other's throats to try and get the best amount of funding from the Treasury. So different departments compete with each other. The bureaucratization of public policy could be that within the civil service, within the administrative system of the state itself, you have different actors competing for interest and for the ear of the Treasury or number 10, or it might be that they just want to ensure that their agenda is put up there within the government's priorities. Policy networks, of course, is important. Now, in policy networks, you have two different types of policy network. You have policy communities and issue networks. Policy communities are those things that can be described as close-knit stakeholders who have similar interests, often share values, and often share resources as well. So a policy network, for instance, is a good example of a policy network would be trade unions who might work together to change employment law and employment policy because they have a similar interest. They might share resources, they might work together, and they might collaborate to seek a particular goal. Group politics is kind of related to another type of policy network, which is called an issue network, which is a looser policy network of interested actors who have generally similar goals, but they might not necessarily share resources, but they might have opportunities to collaborate. So it could be, for instance, different environmental groups from different parts of the economy, or different types of interest organisations with a locus into the environment, who might generally have a shared interest in protecting the environment and working together, but they might not necessarily share resources. They might be organisations in and of themselves with their own interests. Understanding public policy is also about ideas and beliefs. In some ways, you could argue that policy fundamentally is about ideas, because really, what is policy? Well, policy, as you've looked at, can be a number of things, but it's often about decisions, and it's often about action. What the government chooses to do or not to do. What drives what you choose to do or not to do in policy is often based on a set of ideas and principles about how you view society and what you should prioritise, because we know from the laws of economics that resources are fundamentally scarce. So if resources are fundamentally scarce, then you've got to make decisions about how those resources are allocated. So how do you make those decisions? Well, one of the things you do is think about what your values are. If you're a policymaker, you're thinking, what's my political value? Am I going to attach value to one policy area over another as part of my government's manifesto? Is that because it would be more popular, or does it because it sits more closely with my set of ideologies? It could be a number of things, but one of the key aspects here is about how interests, beliefs, ideas shape what the government chooses to do or not to do. And essentially, if you're studying public policy, you're trying to get to grips with what the motivations actually are that lie behind policy. And that's all part of the process of policy analysis. When I talk about policy actors, who am I talking about? Well, policy actors are individuals, groups, and organisations who have an interest in and are involved in the policy process. So essentially, in some walks of life, in some disciplines, you might hear the word stakeholder. A stakeholder is someone that has an interest in the success and failure of an initiative, business, organisation, policy. Policy actors are similar. Policy actors are those individuals, groups, and organisations who have a stake in a particular policy area. So if I was talking about health policy, who might the policy actors there be? Well, I can think of perhaps the NHS, patient groups, might be the Department for Health, might be NHS Confederation, and so on. So a policy actor is someone that has a stake in the policy. And these actors can be part of a policy subsystem. And I began this talk by referring to Paul Kearney and saying that he's interested in complexity ideas and the complexity of public policy, and how one way of trying to deal with the complexities of public policy is to acknowledge that policy exists within a system, and systems can shape policy as well. So it's there's a multi-actor perspective there in many senses. So policy actors are part of that system or subsystem, if you like, in that they are part of an environment, which means that policy researchers like us, like you as students, need to understand their activities, their relationships and interactions, because it's very important to understand the composition of public policy and the way in which it looks and is characterised and its implications. So systems-based perspectives. Now, setting the policy context is very important. So one of the things that you might want to do when you come to looking at policy and looking at a policy problem is laying out who you think your key policy actors are. On this slide, these are just examples of potential actors that might have, general interest in policy. It might be that for your particular policy area, like I've said before, there are specific actors you have to understand and map out and be very clear about. But for more general purposes, examples of policy actors might include people like the judiciary, for instance, the executive. Now, the executive tends to be referred to as the broader institutions of government, or the the broader departments of government. So in many ways, that's a key actor, if you like, within the institutions of government. You've also got the core executive. So the core executive is the, how to say, the dominant core of the administrative system of government. So that could involve Downing Street, the Cabinet Office, the key coordinating bodies in government, if you like, within the machinery of government. Also, with any policy, there needs to be some kind of legislative background, if you like. So, for instance, you've got the executive, you've got the core executive who, in many ways, implement or try and promote the implementation of policy. But you've also got the judicial authorities who might look at the legalities around a policy, particularly if there's a legal challenge about the legality of a policy. The judiciary might get involved. Territorial institutions, that could involve, in the UK, for instance, territorial institutions could include those within devolved governments and even potentially within local government too. So different institutions. Supranational that basically means before the level of the nation state. So above the level of the nation state, supranational and intergovernmental institutions and bodies. So it might be that policy actors that have a locus or interest in your policy actually exist at a broader international level above the level of the nation state. And you, as a policy actor, might have to bargain and compromise and be part of those institutions to secure policy outcomes. There's also supranational economic bodies. So, for example, the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank. The economic dimensions are important here. You're probably all aware from different examples relating to Brexit, the COVID pandemic, and different trade agreements that have been tried to be forged in recent years in the UK, that these international bodies have become very important in many senses because they have key financial oversight over much of policy, but they might also have an international legislative priority attachment to how things are done, how policy is done, and how it's made. Media broadcasters. So media and broadcasters are key actors. And to be honest, this isn't anything new. They always have been, really. But in the age of 24-hour news, social media, the media always want to break the latest story. So in many ways, the media can be very helpful in terms of illuminating policy challenges, but they can also be a challenge to policymakers, trying to keep up with them, trying to build a relationship with them. Now, in some ways, it might be that the relationship becomes too close. So, for example, Tony Blair, former Prime Minister and leader of the new Labour government, he reflected quite recently and talked about how he felt that New Labour, perhaps regrettably, built too much of a relationship with big media, media corporations to try and have a close relationship for their own ends, but then at the same time it works both ways, and that sometimes the media can be an interest group in themselves and might want to seek some influence within government too. So that was something that Tony Blair reflected on quite recently. But also media can also be helpful in that they can have the investigative journalist side of things where they can do their own evaluations and investigate the consequences of public policy. It might not necessarily be from an academic point of view, but this can still shine a light on what's working and not working in society in terms of public policy. Experts can also be key policy actors, for example, independent scientists, academics, and institutionalized knowledge brokers, for example, technocrats. You've probably heard a lot from experts during the pandemic. Experts perhaps within government, your chief medical officers and your chief advisors, scientific advisors within the different scientific advisory structures. And in many ways, you could regard those who work for government, but also technical experts as technocrats. And in many ways, you've probably heard the narratives around the post-truth society and we're tired of experts and so on. I'd be careful with that, because without experts, who do we have left? But what I would suggest is that scientific experts, can have key knowledge that general policymakers might not necessarily have. If you're a parliamentarian making laws and you are not an expert in a particular area, it could be a technical side of public policy that has less attention in the media. Could it be around waste management, water treatment? Could it be around the regulation of the environment? Things like that. It often does require that expert-based approach. So for your policy area, one of the things, for a policy area that you might choose for a case study or write about or be interested in, it might be useful to kind of lay out who you think are the key experts within that policy area or within that policy domain. So policy actors are part of a system. So this demonstrates how. So in many ways, you have the international system, the society and the state. There's a relationship between them. And within that context, within that wider policy universe is a system or subsystem, where you've got an interest network of actors who are working with a similar interest, but they might be surrounded by a wider discourse community. So the discourse community are those that kind of are affected by policy and kind of shape the narrative, or almost kind of intermediaries within a policy system. And I'll give you the example of, for instance, health security policy. So I just thought I'd use this example given the nature of what we've all experienced in recent times around the COVID pandemic, in that, you've got different stakeholders in different parts of the system. So internationally, you might have people like the WHO, the UN, European Commission, could be trade bodies. You also got in wider society, the public, you and me, communities, wider services in the public sector. At state level, you might have the NHS, Department for Health, that's DOH, UK Health Security Agency, the Cabinet Office. So, you've probably heard of COBRA and the Crisis Response Team within Cabinet Office. You have the UK Parliament, who seeks to oversee and scrutinise the government and create legislation. And you also have subnational legislators and executives, Wales, Northern Ireland and Wales. Within the interest network, you've also got key actors that have a key interest in health security policy issues. So for instance, it could be vaccine providers. It could be, if you think about the pandemic, it could be the hospitality industry who've been affected by the COVID restrictions. It could be the sports industry that have been affected by the COVID restrictions. It could be schools, education. NHS Confederation is almost like the representative body for NHS boards, agencies, authorities, a bit like a kind of representative organisation for those things. And the wider discourse community that have an interest in this area, that contribute to public debate, contribute to the shaping of ideas within the public realm through the discourse change, are organisations like political parties, media, and other interest groups. So what you can see in this slide is it's a general policy universe, but within that policy universe is a subsystem of different actors at different levels who have a certain set of interests, if you like, within a policy domain. Okay, so in some ways, what I wanted to do before we go into looking at some of the key policy theories is to give you that knowledge of the complexities of public policy. And let's start on the basis that policy can be seen from a systems-based perspective, where there's multiple accountabilities and relationships. But if we're going to try and control for those things, if we're going to try and make sense of that complexity, what can we do? Well, we can go to theory. One theoretical approach is institutionalist approaches. Institutionalist approaches are concerned with the role of political institutions and generally refers to the regular patterns of behaviour and the rules, norms, practices and relationships that influence that behaviour. Institutions are not just about the physical structure of a building that you can point to. Rather, it is the rules, both informal and formal, procedures, norms, traditions and cultures that influence policy making. If any of you have had a job working in an organisation, it could be a supermarket, it could be a voluntary organisation, it could be a government body or university, wherever. within any organization that you're part of and you're working within, there are always a set of written and unwritten rules, codes of behavior that shape how you behave. Some of those can be manifested physically in terms of uniforms, where you sit. That can give a sense of power dynamic. So do you have your own office or do you not? Do you have the hot desk or do you not? Do you have a, do you have the nicest chair? Do you not have the nicest chair? In some ways, the physical layout and dynamic of an environment can give you a sense of hierarchy, and it can give you a sense of power and where it lies. Now, that's useful in terms of helping us understand the composition of relationships, but it might be that there might be just those behaviours and codes and rules and norms and practices and relationships that might influence our behaviour. So, for instance, if you're working within a professionalised environment, the chances are it would be heavily frowned upon if you used bad language or if you were discourteous, because the environment should generate who's appointed to these jobs, and the people that are appointed to the jobs will know the rules of the game. So the rules of the game is really what institutionalist approaches are really about, understanding how institutions shape us, our behaviours, and how we implement policy, how we approach policy. So is the institutional culture of a policy institution, be it a government department or whatever, is the institutional culture such whereby people are very professional, they're deliberative, they engage, they're quite open, democratic? Is that institutionalist approach manifest itself physically and non-physically? Is it about those informal and formal codes and procedures? So institutionalist approaches try and help us understand the importance of individual and collective institutions in shaping how policy is created, how it manifests, how it's evaluated, and the cultures that shape that. Now, it's important to recognise that there are variants of institutionalism. Historical is also referred to as path dependence, so how events and decisions in the past influence current practices. The idea of stability is important here, in that the investment in one path over time contributes to increasing returns, and therefore it becomes costly to take a different policy path. The past dictates the future in some senses. Change comes as a result of a critical juncture, normally a crisis. So it could be a destabilizing crisis like a pandemic, or it might not necessarily be a crisis, but it could be a change in government at a general election. A new political party takes power, the whole policy path gets reorganized and sorted out in a different direction. So the critical juncture is when it might be change has emerged from that, but normally what kind of historical institutionalists would say is that change in institutions that have a locus in public policy making change very conservatively. And I say conservative with a small c. In other words, gradually, slowly, accumulative practices are developed over time. The past dictates the future. So we're not talking about radical institutional reform here. We're talking about a policy path that's set and it's altered if there's some destabilizing event that punctuates the equilibrium, that changes the path of the crisis. Rational choice is based on the perspective that individuals are utility maximizers within institutions, and they can navigate institutions, and that they know that actions have different consequences in different contexts, and this affects how they pursue their interests. Therefore, institutions constrain behaviour, and these constraints represent the rules of the game in society that shape human interaction. So institutionalist approaches in this sense would say that individuals within institutions want to secure their best wins that they can. It could be you have a set of ambitious people that want to shape, if you like, how the policy terrain is moving in their own interests. Okay, so institutions can constrain those behaviours. So in some ways, if you go into an organization and you're a utility maximizer, it could be that the institution itself constrains your behavior. Okay. Sociological perspective is based on the idea that institutions provide meaning to social life. Institutions are cultural entities who are socially constructed. Equally, individual action is socially constituted by and through institutions. In many ways, this is a bit like the informal codes, the norms, the ways in which we interact with our institutions. From a sociological perspective, the idea is that institutions create a narrative for their existence. There might be a physical structure there, but a sociological interpretation would be that institutions are cultural identities. They have their own cultural dynamic, that they're socially constructed. Okay. Normative perspectives would be where the emphasis is placed more on the norms rather than organizational forms. Yet at the same time, these organizational forms are what define and defend norms and values. So there's a relationship there between the norms and the physical structure of an organization. And you can see there's linkages across these variants of institutionalism, which is fine, because that often happens within theories and in sub-theories. But it's important to just recognize that institutionalist perspectives are a very significant theoretical interpretation of policy making. What are the critiques of institutionalist approaches, though? Because every theory has criticisms. You know, you can't just say that all theories are good and don't have their own weaknesses and drawbacks. The fact that we've actually already have seen variants of institutionalism is a recognition, perhaps, of some of the criticisms that those within the subfields have had for other sub-theories. So what are the critiques? Well, the emphasis on a top-down approach. So, for example, it underplays the role of policy actors implementing change from the bottom up. So that's one argument. Another is that institutionalist approaches might not always be so effective in capturing and explaining radical political change. So you can get radical political change, but you know, our institutionalist approach is really helpful at explaining that radical political change. And in some ways, how do you define a crisis? You know, how big does a crisis have to be for a policy to be path altering? So there's some questions there. There are particular points of critique that can be directed at variants of new institutionalism. For example, you know, for the rational choice interpretation, are all individuals utility maximizers? Is that really what we all are? Aren't we all different? Might be we have our own characters and personalities that shape our behaviours. Can you pigeonhole individual policy actors to have similar aims within a system and similar ambitions? Rules and norms are fundamental to the institutional life, according to institutionalist approaches. But does everyone in institutions interpret rules in the same way? If the social codes are so flexible, it might be that one interprets the rules slightly differently. Are you the type of person to bend the rules? Are you the type of person to seek forgiveness rather than permission? Is everyone like that? You know, so again, it could be that there's a degree of fragmentation there with regards to how we can interpret rules and how it happens. One of the other models of policy making, or kind of theories of policy making, is the rational model. It's generally seen as a kind of ideal type model that can be used to compare with the real world complexities of policy making. So it's based on the work of Herbert Simon, and it's made up of a series of assumptions and characteristics, which are that actors are rational and maximize their utility by weighing up the costs and benefits of their actions. Also, the objective setting takes place before looking for options that might achieve them. So it's common in many managerialist writings on decision-making processes. So a policymaker would, using the rational interpretation, define and rank his or her governing values, specify objectives, I should say comparable, not compactable, comparable with these values. Identify all relevant options or means of achieving these objectives. Calculate all the consequences of these options and compare them. Choose the option or combination of options which would maximize the values either defined as being earlier defined as being most important. So you can see here there's a real structured approach. You're weighing up options, you're making decisions, you're actually not just looking at a series of options, but you're also horizon scanning as to what the potential outcomes of each policy would be. Okay, so this is very much a rational interpretation of how policy making works. But and there's lots of big buts here around the rational model, the rational model, sorry. It's pretty impracticable in the real world of policy making, which can be fast-paced and where the political decision making can be engulfed by uncertainty and risk, because there are different values in the world, different political views. The environment out there in the world of policy making can be very short-termist, isn't always long-termist, sometimes you don't even always have the evidence to underpin an option, a policy option. You know, for instance, is there such a thing as perfect knowledge to influence policy? You know, is the evidence always there of what to do next with policy? Okay. Is the rational model dynamic enough to account for the plethora of actors and interests that perhaps might be within a systems-based perspective? Probably not. You know, consider the example of the referendum on Scottish independence that happened back in 2014. In terms of the policy options, the range of political values and views. You know, different Scottish and UK business leaders took different perspectives on the policy debates. Why is that? Because they're approaching the issue from different ideas, values, and perspectives. And the idea of bounded rationality is less purist in the sense that it acknowledges that policymakers are subject to a range of constraints, and the principles of a rational model could be treated as the ideal to aspire to, and decisions need to be made about what is good enough. So there might be a degree of bounded rationality whereby you try your best to evaluate all the options, you try your best to take a calculated approach to policy making, but you might not have everything at your disposal or all the time available and resources to do it fully alongside the rational model's interpretation of how it should be done. But there might be a degree of bounded rationality where you just do enough to show that you've been evidence-based in many ways. Incrementalism provides a similar critique, though, in terms of the cognitive and problem-solving abilities of policymakers, the resource limitations, and that the rational model doesn't account for the contours and fluidity of political processes. So incrementalism, therefore, is based on the work of Charles Lindblom and his famous text, The Science of Muddling Through. Lindblom identifies a range of issues based on the critique of the rational model, that policy making is more political than technical, that what came before in the policy cycle has implications for what comes next. There's not always a clear direction to the policy process. A greater analytical preoccupation with remedying problems rather than positive goals to be sought. Okay, so they're basically saying that the rational model takes a very problem-solving based approach rather than a kind of strategic, longer-looking perspective. In many ways, that Lindblom kind of argues that, you know, the rational model doesn't actually recognise that policy making is actually also a process of trial and error. Okay, not all policy options are considered, and this is often based on preferences. Change from the status quo are gradual and incremental. Therefore, you know, you can't always rationalise that too much. And in many senses, and I said this earlier, that the incrementalists say, look, the rational model doesn't account for the fact that there is a reciprocal relationship between policy ends and means. It's more of a cyclical, ongoing process. Having said that, you know, if we're going to give the rational model a hard time, it's also possible to give incrementalism a hard time as well. If you think about incrementalism, if it's always about the past dictates the future, and that kind of ongoing cycle process of feedback loops, then you could argue that incrementalism lacks goal orientation, right? Perhaps it's inherently conservative due to its lack of acknowledgement of large-scale change and innovation. Is it undemocratic? So, for instance, where in incrementalism is there the scope to stop and take account of the ways in which we can be more deliberative in the policy process by bringing in a range of actors, communities, and different multi-level policy actors? So is it mainly elite-driven? It could be argued to be. Is it short-sighted due to its lack of vision, its lack of acknowledgement of systematic analysis? Okay, so this could have negative implications. Incrementalism is more suited in many ways to stable policy environments. But again, what about the role of major crisis situations like the big global credit crunch we had back in 2008? You can't argue that incrementalism helps us there in terms of understanding what happened before and after, particularly after the crisis, in terms of the reframing of much public policy after the credit crunch, particularly in the UK, where the economic model and economic policy changed quite significantly, and there was quite significant welfare reforms as well. When you're reading about public policy theory, one of the things that you'll also come across are more structural approaches. And these are perspectives which consider the context, pressures, and constraints on policymakers, often based on the broad perspective that policy processes is a complex system, how there are factors that determine politics. And these factors can include historical, geographic, demographic, economic, social, technological, institutional. Again, you could argue that the policy system perspective that I offered earlier on, and through the diagram that I gave you, is a form of structural approach, and that you're laying out the different actors and structures that surround a policy. But there are also variants of structural perspectives that perhaps focus more on the power dynamics. For instance, if you look at Marxist perspectives on structural dimensions, so that really focuses on the role of elites and where the power resides within elites, focuses on the structure of government and decision-making, the idea that the government is there to preserve the capitalist system of economic production, the idea that policymakers privilege business interests and that such actors have direct access to the corridors of power. In many ways, there's a close relationship between big, powerful people in industry and government, and the idea that perhaps that is a problematic relationship in terms of inequality and generating an inherent inequality within public policy. So the perspective that those in senior public policy roles are also of a particular class, and that they share a common background, which predisposes them to work with each other. So a kind of the social dimension, if you like, of the hierarchy is something that perhaps you might be familiar with if you've ever studied senior levels of the civil service. They tend to be, they used to be anyway, and it's not quite as bad now, but it's still bad in a way if you're looking at the Oxbridge bias. So those that are graduates from Oxford and Cambridge tend to rise to the higher levels of the civil service. Why is that? So this idea that government actors forge close networks, which are not always in the interest of wider participation and democratic processes. However, can all public policies be seen in the context of preserving the capitalist system? For example, is it always the case? Is it the case that policy is so elitist and elitist driven, and that the capitalist system is the dominant model? Well, you could point to some examples of that, I'm sure, but there's also examples to the contrary. So consider the post-Second World War setting up of the welfare state, creation of the NHS, very much a state-driven, egalitarian policy, and many would argue that perhaps that was very much a social democratic left-wing policy. Of course, I'm sure you'll have your own views, but is there still a class system there? Consider the perspective of meritocracy. Has there been greater shifts in social mobility? There has been. I think most studies do indicate that there has been some change in social mobility, but I think there's a long way to go on that. You just need to look at the senior levels of the civil service to see that from a policy angle. But these are questions, interesting questions around where power lies and how it looks and how it manifests within the policy environment. You've also got structural perspectives. So, for instance, around globalization. So, in some ways, globalization is a bit of a vague term, but it refers to the interdependence between states driven by economic liberalization and the changing nature of the world economy, supported by political bodies such as the IMF, World Bank, the WTO, for instance. It may also refer to the social and cultural integration of actors as a result of a greater interaction between countries and their populations. Globalization perspectives are also associated with the rapid developments in IT, and also highlights the changing patterns of international and national governments. However, some social scientists believe that globalization is a bit of a myth, and that there's always been transnational flows of goods, information, but it's not necessarily more important now. It could be argued by some, and that states aren't as constrained as is often suggested. But I think it's fair to say that globalization has increased the rise of cyber terror, the rise of the interconnection between financial systems. One problem in one part of the system can lead to ripple effects to other parts of the system. We saw that with the global financial crisis, for instance, with the mortgage subprime market in America. That went belly up, which led to multiple recessions in Europe, and therefore it led to the cuts in public expenditure within the UK, which led to welfare reform and a number of different things. So you can't necessarily say it's a complete myth. In fact, it has real world consequences. There's also an argument, and it's important to acknowledge it, that the idea of economic interdependence cannot be said to be equally distributed. So the costs and benefits of globalization are not distributed evenly across the world. It is the developed states that often reap the most benefits of economic interdependence, which leads to a widening of the gap between the rich north and the poor south. I think we can see that with a number of areas of public policy, most recently perhaps with the rollout of the vaccines to address the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that's been a very unequal affair between rich and poor countries. Often as well, the idea of globalization is based on the idea that economic interdependence is a good thing. Consider, again, the global financial crisis and the ripple effects of that on national public policy. Again, we've talked about that. So the trickle effects, if you like, of globalization. And I guess it talks to that issue that we've mentioned, is policy is often about relationships. So understanding relationships through a globalized perspective is really what you're trying to do, is to say, for one policy area, is it the case that it's been shaped by a global interdependence between political bodies and other organizations? So if you're interested, for instance, on trade policy is a really interesting one, because you can look at trade policy from a globalization perspective, but the fact that globalization can change in its manner and its characterization, because if you think about trade policy now compared to before Britain left the European Union, then the composition of international trade and the globalization of that looks different now than it did before Brexit, because Brexit had led to the end of the free movement of services, goods, and people. So therefore, the UK government had to strike trade deals, and still striking trade deals with different organisations and so on. Therefore, the manner and character and structure and composition of globalisation can shift in terms of how it looks over time. Rational choice theory is often referred to as public choice theory, and it's very much an economic perspective on public policy. And it's influenced by neoclassical economics and emphasises individualism, and essentially makes the assumption that individuals are fundamentally driven by self-interest, and people act according to their preferences to maximise their utility. So in many ways, public policy is about trying to maximise the economic efficiency of policy. in terms of its implementation. So in governmental terms, an example would be acting in a rational choice way, would be where bureaucrats will seek to maximise their budgetary allocation for their departments at a government spending review, and perhaps seek to maximise their salaries and increase the size of their departments. This links very closely with the bureaucratic politics discussion we had earlier in the talk. Also, the theory could apply to the voting preferences of the electorate, in that people might vote for candidates or parties that they think will benefit them the most in terms of the rewards they could seek, they could receive from government. So it's all about the individual endeavour in many ways and interest. However, criticisms of the rational choice theory can include individualism and career-driven bureaucrats cannot always be assumed. Is it always the case that all people think in the same way and have the same objectives? Well, no. Aren't people always motivated by emotions? So is it always about economic considerations? Are we not motivated by other things like revenge, love, envy? It's not always about the economic imperatives. So in some ways, you'd argue the theory oversimplifies human psychology. Governance is a broad perspective on public policy, and it refers to the role of the state in the policy process, the patterns of rules from a hierarchical approach to a decentralised approach to a multi-level approach. And this is really based on the debates in the UK and in other places about the state being hollowed out. So the state centre doesn't necessarily have all the power that it used to have, because there's so many policy actors that have power, and the state is only one actor in the policy process. It's also a term that's been used to describe the importance of international organisations and their connections between states, very similar to globalization here, for example, global governance. Consider the example of the pandemic. It could be COVID, influenza, and general health security issues. International bodies have to come together to try and solve a problem. Often, governance is referred to in terms of the role of the state with regards to its relationship with non-state actors, private business, the market, third sector. So this approach has a pluralist orientation, and this leads to questions about how the state manages policy networks and partnerships. And it also refers to how to ensure accountability and democratic governance, or even good governance. Yet questions that are raised by the emphasis on governance include: has the state really been hollowed out? Is it the case that this perspective often downplays the power of the centre? When I say centre, I mean, if you're talking about Britain, it would be UK government, the centre of government. Is it really the case that the power in the centre has been hollowed out? Is Brexit an example, perhaps, of where the power has taken back some control, if I can use that bad slogan, taken back control, and that the sovereignty that they give away can be taken back again? So does governance always help us address that? Does governance capture too much and therefore weaken its explanatory power? Because it does cover a lot of areas. Governance is about relationships between all kinds of organisations in multiple directions. Therefore, is it more of a metaphor than a theory? Is it better as a device that describes dynamics in the policy context rather than being a powerful theoretical approach? So that's one of the big criticisms of governance. There's a range of other conceptual approaches that you'll be aware of, that you'll read about. There's a multitude of sub-theories and ideas, but I've introduced the dominant ones for you in this talk. There'll be more reading for you to go into, and that will be provided on the Moodle site in terms of suggestions for future reading. But I think it's fair to say that a range of other theoretical frameworks help us to understand the policy-making process. And many of these tend to be more relevant for particular stages of the process. So, for instance, Advocacy Coalitions. Advocacy Coalitions is a network-based theory or concept related to public policy. And what that really does is help us understand how policy entrepreneurs, as they describe it, key innovators, key actors, help to form a network, but are also part of a network that try and shape policy making. Multiple streams theory, and there's reading on this provided for you on the Moodle site, is really about how ideas take hold, how the role of politics, the ideas and the context come together to change the agenda. So this is really an agenda setting type theory of policy making. But then there are other comparative approaches as well that are important. If you're looking at, say you're looking at a public policy and you're interested in making a comparison between a policy in this country and another country, because you think another country might learn from the UK, for instance. So I've got a PhD student who's looking at dementia policy in Scotland, because Scotland is generally regarded by the authorities and the interest organisations and so on as having a good approach to how you approach that area. So how dementia policy is addressed is seen as good in Scotland generally. So my PhD student is looking at the dementia policy in Bangladesh, and it's fair to say that Bangladesh's dementia policy has a lot of work to do, and it's not necessarily always evidence-based, and there's some governance issues that surround it. Therefore, the methodology that this student is employing is to use the policy transfer literature to help guide him do a comparison of how Bangladesh can learn from Scotland. And I'm sure they would agree or vice versa there as well. But that theoretical or conceptual approach is an organising framework for doing comparative public policy. There's also other variants of that: lesson drawing, policy diffusion. I'll not go into the details on that because you can read more on it. But I guess it's just fair to say that when you're approaching public policy, it's important to recognise that there are comparative approaches as well, and that you might want to do a study or undertake public policy in a way where you're actually looking across boundaries. You're looking across countries, or even areas within countries, within areas, within regions. That would be a comparative approach. And that also relates to how you design policy research as well. So, as by way of a summary, policy actors come in many forms and operate in the context of systems or subsystems. There are a range of ways to approach the study of public policy. Each theoretical approach have their own features and important insights, but each have their own limitations as well, and it's important to recognise that. Overall, public policy making is rarely unidirectional and is often characterised by fluidity and non-linearity. Many of the themes discussed in today's lecture will be revisited in different lectures and in different themes and across the reading in the module. Again, this is just an introduction. There are many theories that try to capture the rationality or the irrationality of public policy from different lenses. But again, just like I always say, it will be impossible for you to get a full understanding simply from this talk. You have to read to embed your learning and do your research into theories of public policy. That's the key thing. It's very important to do that. It's very important to get a grip through the reading on these different ideas and theories. And I hope you enjoy that process. Some references, there's some more references that are going to be provided to you on the Moodle site. And so please refer to the Moodle site for more information. But these are some of the key readings or kind of beginning readings that I would suggest that you might want to focus on in terms of taking things forward for your general reading interest, if that's helpful to you, and hopefully this has been helpful to you. So thank you very much.